1950. Only 5 years have passed since the bloody battles of the Second World War died down, but unfortunately, it was not possible to achieve world peace. Almost immediately after the surrender of Germany and Japan, the Allies and the anti-Hitler coalition were divided into two camps led by the United States and the Soviet Union, after which a new confrontation began. Fortunately, memories of the horrors of the Second World War were still fresh, so both opposing camps tried with all their might to avoid open military confrontation. The Cold War began, in which both sides tried to expand their zone of influence as much as possible, using a variety of methods. Soon, the Korean Peninsula became one of the centers of confrontation between the former Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition. It should be mentioned that until the end of Second World War, the Korean Peninsula was under the control of the Japanese Empire. Peasant uprisings periodically broke out on the peninsula, which were brutally suppressed by the Japanese authorities. Nevertheless, the local population continued to fight against Japanese power. The core of the resistance was the Korean Society for the Revival of the Fatherland, which was headed by the commander of the 6th Division of the Second Front of the United Anti-Japanese Army, Kim Il-sung. The Japanese gendarmes also did not sit idly by, and by 1940 they managed to completely suppress the armed resistance in Korea, arresting a significant part of the leaders of the Society for the Revival of the Fatherland. The situation changed on August 8, 1945, when the Soviet Union, in accordance with an agreement previously concluded with the United States, declared war on the Japanese Empire. In just 15 days, Soviet troops defeated the Guangdong group of the Japanese army and entered the territory of the Korean Peninsula from the north. Around the same time, the U.S. Army landed troops in southern Korea. Already on August 10, realizing the inevitability of the surrender of the Japanese Empire, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to divide the Korean Peninsula along the 38th parallel, assuming that Japanese troops north of the parallel would surrender to the Soviet Army, and south of the parallel would surrender to the U.S. Army. Despite the fact that the mentioned division, according to the concluded agreement, was supposed to be temporary, governments were already formed in December 1945 in the northern and southern parts of the peninsula. In the south of the peninsula, the United States, with the support of the UN, held elections and, since leftist parties boycotted them, the main government was elected Syngman Rhee. A communist government was formed in the northern part of the peninsula, headed by Kim Il-sung. The planned reunification of Korea never happened because the Soviet Union and the United States simply could not agree on how it would happen. At the same time, both Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung planned to unite all of Korea under their rule. This goal was reflected in the constitutions adopted both in the south in the Republic of Korea and in the north in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The fact that according to the constitution, Seoul, located in the south, was proclaimed the capital of the DPRK, and Pyongyang only temporarily performed its functions. In the current situation, the outbreak of an armed conflict between North and South Korea was a matter of time. This was understood, both in the Soviet Union and in the United States, and therefore they prepared the armies of North and South Korea for possible military operations. By the time hostilities began, the North Korean army consisted of 175,000 soldiers, 150 T-34 tanks and 172 combat aircraft, including the Yak-9. As for the Army of South Korea, its number was 93,000 soldiers. It also had at its disposal 5 territorial defense brigades and a 20,000-strong corps of special units assigned to the police. Thus, the command of the South Korean army had at its disposal 161,000 soldiers, 30 tanks and 40 combat aircraft, including the P-51 Mustang. On June 25, 1950, shortly before dawn, the North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel under artillery cover. The start of hostilities was quite successful for the North Korean army, and already on June 28 it managed to capture Seoul, but Syngman Rhee himself and most of the Korean leadership managed to leave the city. Nevertheless, the South Korean army was unable to organize defense and stop the North Korean troops. Under enemy pressure, the South Korean army quickly retreated. Immediately after the outbreak of hostilities in New York, the UN Security Council was convened, at which approval was received for the deployment of UN troops to Korea. This became possible only due to the fact that the Soviet ambassador Yakov Malik did not participate in the vote and did not use his veto power. Nevertheless, the South Korean army and the British and American divisions that came to its aid were forced to continue their retreat. For the sake of fairness, it should be mentioned that only the entry of the American army into the war prevented the defeat of the South Korean troops, allowing them to retain 10% of their territory by August 4 and organize defense on the so-called Pusan perimeter. The formation of defense on the Pusan perimeter was given to the armies of South Korea and the UN at a high price, since during the offensive the North Korean army managed to inflict serious losses on them and capture the commander of the 24th U.S. Infantry Division, Major General Dean. Nevertheless, the UN army, which mainly consisted of American troops, continued to build up its force in the conflict zone. By the beginning of September, the total strength of the South Korean army and UN forces was 160,000 soldiers, 500 tanks and 1634 guns. In the vicinity of the Pusan perimeter they were confronted by a 70,000-strong North Korean army, which had 40 tanks and 811 guns. Having achieved an overwhelming advantage in numbers and weapons, the American command developed a plan to destroy the North Korean army. In accordance with this plan, the American fleet was supposed to land troops in the city of Icheon, which was supposed to begin moving to the east and cut off the enemy's path to retreat. At the same time, the main attack group was supposed to launch an offensive from the Daegu region to the north. On September 10, the American army began air and artillery bombardment of Incheon. Already on September 15, a landing operation began in the Incheon area, and the South Korean army, together with UN forces, launched an offensive from the Daegu area. North Korean troops were unable to withstand the onslaught of a numerically superior enemy and were forced to retreat. Already on September 21, the American troops that landed in Incheon crossed the Han River and occupied a bridgehead northwest of Seoul. The situation for the North Korean army was deteriorating every day, so already on September 25, it received an order to begin retreating beyond the 38th parallel. At the same time, the Seoul group of troops, having received reinforcements, was supposed to take up defense in the city area. It was not possible to implement this plan, since very soon the control of the North Korean army was disrupted and it had to retreat beyond the 38th parallel in scattered groups. By the beginning of October, the armies of the UN and South Korea reached the 38th parallel, after which it was decided to continue the offensive with the goal of completely defeating the army of North Korea and occupying its territory. According to the developed plan, the army was supposed to advance in two directions in order to, having captured the cities of Pyongyang and Wonsan, reach the borders of China and the Soviet Union as quickly as possible. The offensive by the UN and South Korean armies began on October 11. The North Korean army offered fierce resistance, but it clearly did not have enough strength to stop the enemy's advance. Already on October 20, the U.S. Army landed a 5,000-strong airborne assault force 45 kilometers north of Pyongyang. The local garrison was unable to effectively resist the enemy army advancing simultaneously from the north and south and very soon was forced to surrender the city. The UN and South Korean armies continued to move towards the border of China and the USSR. It should be mentioned that back at the end of September it was obvious that the North Korean army would not be able to cope with the onslaught of an enemy that outnumbered it both in numbers and in the number of heavy weapons. Since the Soviet Union and China could not allow the complete defeat of North Korea back in early October, China sent a warning to the UN that it intended to enter the war if anyone other than the Korean military crossed the 38th parallel, knowing full well that the South Korean army simply would not be able to continue on its own advance deep into North Korea. The allies of South Korea also understood this, so on October 8, American troops crossed the 38th parallel, and, therefore, the move was in China. It is important to mention that the Soviet Union, fearing the outbreak of a nuclear war with the United States, did not plan to use its ground army, but was ready to provide air support, since China and North Korea did not have the forces to fight American bombers. Meanwhile, the offensive of the UN and South Korean armies continued and they managed to reach the Korean-Chinese border in the Hyesangan area, capturing Korean ports located in the northeast. They also reached the Pakshan area, where, Faced with fierce resistance from the North Korean army, they were forced to stop the offensive. At this time, Chinese divisions, officially called Chinese People's Volunteers, began to arrive in Korea in order to prevent the outbreak of open confrontation between China and the United States. In turn, the Soviet Union sent its own aviation to the combat area, which was supposed to provide support to the Chinese and North Korean troops by protecting them from enemy aircraft, but since Soviet pilots were prohibited from approaching closer than 100 kilometers to the front line, they were only able to provide rear protection North Korean army from bombing. Before the start of the counter-offensive by North Korean and Chinese troops, they had a group of about 300,000 soldiers, but at the same time they had practically no heavy weapons at their disposal. The UN and South Korean armies numbered about 254,000 soldiers, but they had an overwhelming advantage in heavy weapons. The Chinese and North Korean armies launched an offensive on November 25. With a powerful blow they were able to break through the enemy's defenses in the Sonkan area and, as a result of bloody battles, destroy most of the 2nd South Korean Corps, after which they continued the offensive. Already on November 29, the command of the U.S. Army ordered a retreat along the entire front, as the situation was worsening every hour. Pursuing the retreating armies of the UN and South Korea, North Korean and Chinese divisions entered Pyongyang on December 5. To avoid encirclement, the army began evacuating from Hamhung and Hungnam, which continued until December 24, when these cities, as well as Wonsan, fell into the hands of the North Korean army. On the same day, Chinese and North Korean troops reached the 38th parallel. Continuing the offensive, the North Korean army occupied Seoul on January 4, 1951. The American command understood the complexity of the situation and even thought about using nuclear weapons. Fortunately, nuclear bombings, which could have started a new world war, were avoided. The fact is that the offensive of the North Korean and Chinese divisions, which suffered from a lack of heavy weapons and supply difficulties, soon fizzled out and the armies of the UN and South Korea managed to stabilize the front on the Suwon, Wonju, Samcheok line by the end of January 1951. At this time, ceasefire negotiations were held, but were unsuccessful. Meanwhile, having received reinforcements, UN troops launched an offensive on February 21, 1951, which developed quite successfully. Using their advantage in the air and heavy weapons, already on March 14, UN troops were able to regain control of Seoul and continue to push back the enemy. Gradually, the onslaught of the UN army weakened, and on April 22, the armies of North Korea and China launched a counter-offensive, pushing back enemy divisions from the 38th parallel. However, they failed to build on their success by re-occupying Seoul. On May 16, Chinese and North Korean divisions again attempted an offensive, planning to capture Seoul, but due to supply problems, this offensive quickly fizzled out, after which on May 21, the UN and South Korean armies launched a counteroffensive, which turned out to be quite successful. They managed to push the enemy back to the 38th parallel, but fearing a counterattack, the American command decided not to continue the offensive deep into North Korea. By the summer of 1951, it became obvious that the confrontation had reached a dead end, since the number of armies on each side of the conflict had reached 1 million soldiers, which is why any serious success could be achieved only at the cost of huge losses. Both sides of the conflict understood this, and on July 8, 1951, negotiations began in Kaesong to conclude a truce. During the negotiations, both sides attempted an offensive, but these attempts did not bring any serious results. Finally, on July 27, 1953, a ceasefire agreement was concluded, which fixed the front line in the area of the 38th parallel, and also envisaged the creation of a demilitarized zone around it. A peace treaty between North and South Korea was never signed and both countries are still at war, although both sides adhere to the ceasefire agreement. It is important to understand that both states did not abandon the idea of uniting the entire Korean peninsula under their rule, so time will tell how exactly the story of the two Koreas will end. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos.